think my old bedtime story has a more sinister meaning. Every night, my dad was in charge of putting me to bed. He would help me brush my teeth and then would tuck me into my nice, warm bed. Then he would tell me a story. Every night, it was the same one. The story of Bosco and Billy. I had lots of books in my room, as my mother would read to me throughout the day. But Dad would never read any of those books. He would always tell me the same story. I always assumed that either the story had come from a book, but my father had told it so many times that he didn't need to read from the book anymore, or that it was a story he was told as a child. I always enjoyed the story of Bosco and Billy. I always found that it would help me go to sleep. Usually, I would be almost asleep by the end of the story. I slowly learned all the words to the story and would sometimes recite it along with my dad. For some reason, probably because I heard it every night for years, the story stuck in me, and even to this day, I still remember all the words to the story. The story, in its entirety, is as follows. Billy the bear was an ordinary bear with an ordinary life, but he had a small friend named Bosco who got him into strife. Most of the time Bosco would behave, but sometimes he acted out. Billy tried to keep him in line, but sometimes he would break out. Like one time Bosco was hungry and decided he would steal food. Billy tried to stop him and explained to Bosco that stealing is rude, but Bosco didn't listen. He stole the food anyway and took it to his secret spot and hid it away. Bosco took the food to the large oak tree that was in the woods. There he stuffed the food inside, and that's where he hid his goods. Billy never found the stolen food. It's still hidden there to this day. Bosco wishes that it is never found. He hopes and he prays. Billy is kind and Bosco is a little bit silly. And that is the story of Bosco and Billy. Now, the story seems innocent enough, and I always thought it was a cute little story about two bears. But after recent events, I now know it's a lot more sinister than it first appears. My dad passed away a few years ago, and it took a toll on all of us, my mom especially. She began a little bit reclusive after my father passed, and so I didn't see her as often because she shut herself off from others. I spent a long time trying to create a relationship with my mother again, and slowly, over the course of a couple of years, I did manage to reconnect with her. Things weren't as they once were, but she did invite me over once a week for a cup of coffee. During these hour-long visits, we would sit in the kitchen and talk about times gone by, about my childhood, about my time at school, and about all the good times we had together. The one subject that didn't come up, however, was my father. I think the pain was still too raw for my mom to talk about him. On one of my weekly visits though, I thought that I would try and mention my father, as I felt that it might do mom some good to talk about him. I decided to mention the story that he would tell me every night. Do you remember that story Dad used to tell me before bed? The story of Billy and Bosco? I hesitantly asked, not knowing how Mom would react to the mention of her late husband. Mom looked up from her cup of coffee that she was drinking. She looked confused. Maybe because it was the first time he had been mentioned for a number of years, or maybe because she didn't know what I was talking about. "No, I don't remember that story," she replied. "You had a lot of books, so I can't remember all of them." I was a bit surprised by this. Dad told it to me every night, so I would have thought that she would remember it. I then went on to explain that it wasn't a book. It was a story they would recite without reading off of a page, because he knew it so well. "I thought that your father would read you a different book each night," she said, sounding confused. "That's what he always told me anyway." I thought that this was especially strange because he never read me one of my books, and I would have thought that my own mother would have known this. "What was this story about?" she asked me. "It was about two bears, one named Billy and one named Bosco." I was about to continue explain the story when my mom suddenly interrupted me. Did you just say the bear was named Bosco? She asked me, sounding quite serious. Yeah, that's right. His name was Bosco, I replied. That's strange, Mom said. She had a look on her face that looked like she was trying to remember something. Your father used to tell me about a friend that he used to have named Bosco, Mom continued. He used to say that Bosco would get him in a lot of trouble when he was younger. I never met this Bosco, which your dad said was a good thing. He also said that he only met up with Bosco only once or twice after we met. And then your father told me that he was no longer going to see Bosco. He said that he finally got rid of him. I was always curious as to who he was. I have never seen any photos of him or any evidence that he existed now that I think about it. So, it is strange that he told you a story that contained a character with the name Bosco. Mom stopped talking for a second and I didn't know how to respond. She then looked at me and asked, Do you remember this story? Can you tell it to me? I recited the entire story to her. She listened to the whole tale without changing her expression. She took it all in and then she asked, An oak tree? Are you sure that Bosco hid the food in an oak tree in the woods? Yeah, it was definitely an oak tree. Why is that? I asked her, sensing that something wasn't quite right. It's just that on mine and your father's first date, he took me to an old oak tree that was inside the Shelton Woods, only a 10-minute drive from here, she responded. He told me then that it was lucky for me that Bosco hadn't decided to interrupt their date. She then stopped talking and stared at the wall behind where I was sitting. I think it's time for you to go now. I'm sorry, she told me, a hint of sadness in her voice. I thought that maybe it was for the best that I did leave. I got up and gave her a small hug, which she didn't even seem to notice. Then I collected my things and headed out the front door. I got into my car and began to drive home. On the way home, however, the thought of the old oak tree and Bosco began to fill my head. I couldn't escape these thoughts. I didn't know what it all meant, if it meant anything at all. I don't know what compelled me, but I had to visit the Shelton Woods and find this oak tree. I turned my car around and headed in the direction of the woods. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. I took a step forward and entered them. I didn't know exactly where this oak tree was, but I was determined to find it. I explored the woods for around 10 minutes before I saw it. Standing in front of me was a huge oak tree, its branches extending high up into the sky. I walked over to the base of the tree. A sense of fear started to overcome me. Something didn't feel right. It felt like something terrible had happened here. I looked down at the ground at the base of the tree, and I saw that the dirt there looked slightly different than the rest of the dirt in the woods. I don't know why I did this, but I bent down and began to dig in this dirt. The police say that if I hadn't started digging, then they probably never would have found them. There were 4 bodies in total, all young women around the age of 24. All of them had been dead for over 30 years. It was undeniable. They were all murdered and buried under this tree. The DNA testing was also clear. My father was responsible for the killings. Somehow, he managed to keep all of this hidden for many years. He never told anyone. The only clues that he gave were through my bedtime story, which I think was his way of confessing. The only thing I am not sure of now is, who is Bosco? Maybe my father and Bosco are the same person, or maybe he really did have a friend with that name. I don't think we will ever know. I don't think I want to know. I grew up in a cult. Here's how I left. My mother sat across from me, leaning forward onto the old oak desk in her office. That's what she called it, her office, even though it was just that desk, a stack of old papers, and her chair in a room, no bigger than a walk-in closet. I remember there was an insect flying around the overhead light. clanking into the bulb every so often. That would draw my attention away from my mother's words until she would snap her fingers to draw me back in. Eventually, she told me to listen up or else the consequences would be huge. The insect was of no fascination to me anymore. My older brother and I were homeschooled. She was our teacher and she took her job seriously. She was questioning me in regard to my brother's absence from class that morning. I said I didn't know where he was. That was the truth. For the most part, she insisted that because we share a room, I must have known something about his whereabouts. Again, I said I didn't know where he was. For perhaps the first time in my life, I noticed my mother's age. Her face sagged as if the weight of iron bars was bringing her skin down. Whether it was due to stress or a lack of sleep or any other reason in the world, she looked far older than I had ever noticed before. After a while of her sitting there, staring at me with those burdening eyes, both of her arms folded across the edge of the desk, I finally suggested that we go looking for him. "And just where do you suppose we could find him?" she asked. "The woods, maybe." "You know we aren't to go into the woods. I don't think he would have made it that far anyway. Somebody surely could have stopped him in time." "I don't know then. I don't know where he is." She stared at me for another infinite moment. Finally, the tension in her eyes broke. "Well then, you'll just have to go to your room and don't come out." So I did. I trotted back to my room. It was only a few steps away from her office, but tears had already begun to well in my eyes because I knew where my brother was. He did go into the woods, and I knew the exact path that he told me he was going to take. Like my brother, I wanted to leave. Unlike my brother, I was too afraid at that time to face the unknown. After all, I had never been in those woods, nor had I ever seen what sort of a world existed beyond them, if any, for all I knew. I woke up that next morning to my mother banging on my bedroom door. Every morning it seemed to be only one more beating away from falling off the hinges. I often wished it would, just so I wouldn't have to listen to that beating at 6:30 every morning. "Come on, come on, come on! Don't be late for class!" she yelled. She would repeat this constantly until I told her I was up and getting ready. My classroom was just in the main room of the house. I sat on a chair. She sat beside me. A desk was in between us in case either of us needed to write something down. I remember that morning. I remember how my mother looked, hollow. Perhaps she looked like exactly what she was, a mother grieving her missing son, struggling to accept that there are far more important things in life, things for the future. I suspected that she went and consulted my father that previous night. That's what she usually would do in a crisis. He always reassured her that good things will come. I said my pledge before sitting down. I was to always open the curtains and look at the middle house on property as I said it. It went like this: "To my father, I thank you. Through you, the seeds of my life were sown. I will give my all to you until there is none left to give. I am of you, and of you I will always be. I am with you, and with you I will always be." I sat down beside mother. She wasted no time telling me the story of a boy that ran from home decades ago. That boy, just a teenager at the time, was called upon by God to leave the horrors of society behind and to organize a group of good, faithful individuals, people that would act as God's replacement to society after its collapse. The man changed his name to Gabriel King before forming a community with a dozen women. Each woman was to bear 2 of his children. He warned the woman that their community is not immune and that one day a child will fall victim to Satan's temptations. That child will leave the community with the intention of bringing shame upon it. He also warned that following the first departure, another child will be granted by God the freedom of choice, either to stay and render his will or leave and have the eternal horrors of Satan's doing bestowed upon him. That is the prophecy, my mother stated. You, based on clear evidence according to your father, are the one granted that right to choose. Not to sway your opinion, but I must ask, do you choose morality, comfort, and our goodwill? Or do you choose immorality and a disease, evil livelihood? She walked towards the door, careful not to let her black shirt drag the floor, and opened it. If you choose to leave, she continued, I will not stop you. It would be an interference with God's will. A cool breeze flowed into the room. I sat in silence for a moment, contemplating, twiddling a button on my shirt. I'll stay, I muttered. I had no real intentions of staying, and I knew that. Truthfully, I was afraid of the possibility that she was right, that I was choosing the will of Satan and turning my back on all that is good. My mind was made up, but I couldn't bring myself to admit my true feelings. Good, my mother said, then went directly into a new lesson. Days and days went by until finally, on a night of no other significance, I worked up the courage to follow my brother's footsteps, almost literally, and never see the stale, dusty, foul-smelling shack that I had called home for all my years. There was nothing to my plan, just walk out the front door and leave. That's simple. Only it wasn't that simple, not in practice. Sure, I wouldn't have to worry about things the way my brother did. Everybody by this point had probably heard of the prophecy, and they would let me go. The issue is that my struggle was internal. Every day for years, I had given my allegiance to one man, to one lifestyle, and like everybody else around me, I held onto my faith without question. I believed in his sayings more than his doings, and I suppose that a part of me was not ready to let that go. I had been educated only by the standards of my own small world. The idea that something bigger may be out there, ready to prove me insignificant, was terrifying. Leaving home for the first time was a wager on reality itself. Leaving and staying were both dreadful. My mind was juggling spheres of different colors. I realized that I was pulling my own hair. That's it. That's enough thinking, I thought. It's time for me to go. I walked straight into the woods. I wondered how many people in these small homes had considered doing what I was doing. I could barely do it myself, so I just kept on walking. The woods are loud at night. Bugs and frogs and birds all chimed into some horrifying harmony. Wolves and coyotes made their noises heard on occasion as well. I couldn't begin to know what else was out there. Sometimes it sounded like something was behind me. I'd look, but of course nothing was there. I was sure that I was psyching myself out, but the sense of something behind me remained throughout the entirety of the night. I was sure that I heard somebody screaming for help. My brother, oh dear God, my brother is still in the woods, crying, screaming, pleading for help. I turned left towards the screams. They sounded further away. I turned right and they were farther away again. I moved forward again, but the screams, his begging, never sounded any closer. I couldn't turn back. Oh no, I couldn't turn back. By that point, I had been walking forever, listening to his pleading stab my ears, always sounding the same distance away no matter how much I walked. I threw up a prayer to whatever entity wanted to listen. I didn't care at that point. To please let it all be in my head. I'd rather be going crazy than have to listen to my poor innocent brother scream for help when there is nothing I can seem to do about it. I kept on moving, not even willing to stop when the pain of the rocks and needles and twigs on the ground made my feet bleed and sting. At some point, the sky lightened up. Many of the noises, including the screaming, subsided. The birds sang much more lovely music. Finally, I came to the edge of the woods and everything was calm. The edge of the woods was nothing more than a long, narrow clearing before the trees began again. A trail of a fading black rock made a seam straight through it. Yellow and white lines ran the middle and edges of it. Now I know that was a road. At that time, I had never seen one. It never came up during schoolroom discussions. My legs were excruciatingly sore. My feet had moved past the point of pain and were now numb lumps of meat shelled in mud and blood. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to meet. In fact, I was afraid of seeing anybody. Soon enough, I felt the ground rumble just a tiny bit and heard a dull whistling. I turned my head and waited. When I saw it, I knew what it was. In school, my mother had explained that a vehicle is a machine that can transport people faster than God had ever intended humans to travel. If we were meant to move that fast, she'd say, God would have made our legs go that fast. Funny how she said all that, and I didn't bother to mention the roads they drive on. It was a big vehicle with an open box attached to the back. I didn't expect vehicles to look like that. It slowed down and stopped on the grass beside the road. The driver hopped out and ran to me. I considered running back into the woods. This man is going to snatch me and commit unspeakable sins against me. Surely that's what he's going to do, I thought. I felt paralyzed and couldn't run away, even if I wanted to. The man stopped before me. He was mostly normal looking, a bit bigger than most people I had ever known. There was hair on his face, something I had never seen before. "Oh my God, son," he said. "I ain't even gonna worry about asking you no questions. Get in. I need to take you to the police." He finished off his sentence by taking off his hat, scratching his thinning head of hair and carefully replacing the hat. I followed him back into his truck, half trusting him and half afraid of what might happen if I didn't. The first time I saw Police Chief Richards, he was leaned back in his office chair with his feet on his desk. When he saw me, he promptly dropped his feet and leaned forward. His eyes appeared to widen to the size of apples. He motioned for me to come forward and have a seat. The chief calmly did another visual scan over me, then looked back at the man who walked me into the office. Calmly, he looked at the man and said, "Jesus, Leonard, I've seen some shit in my day, but nothing like this. What's the story?" "A guy found him on the side of the road, brought him straight here. That's it. I think the kid says he doesn't have a name, but I can barely understand him." "Well, boy," the chief looked back at me. "Come and take a seat. I'm Police Chief Richards, by the way. You don't have a name, I suppose. How old are you? Do you know where you're from?" "I am 14. You're not going to hurt me, are you?" I asked. Chief Richards kept his right ear toward me as I talked. He shifted his eyes to continue looking at me. He listened carefully and intently. "You're asking if we'd hurt you. Now why on earth would we do that?" "No, we ain't here to hurt you. We want to help you, 'cause you look like you sure could use some of it. Now where are you from?" He spoke softly and smiled again at the end of his sentences. "The woods," I told him in order to keep it short and understandable. "I'm looking for my brother. Have you seen him?" "Looking for your mother?" "Leonard, shut the door behind you and take some notes, would you?" "Son, I'll be happy to talk about your mother and see what we can do. I need some basic information first. Do you know where at in the woods you come from?" "No." "Brother," I said. I even drew a B and an R in the air so he'd understand. "Oh, your brother. Leonard, hand this boy a sheet of your paper and pen. It'd be a lot easier if you could write this stuff down for us, okay?" I wrote down all the information I could give him. I wrote that I was 14, looking for my brother, and am from a community in the woods, but I have no idea where at in the woods. "Okay, how many people in the community?" 35 now. My brother and I are gone," I wrote. "Okay, son, we'll send some people out there to find this place. They must be the ones that did this to you, right?" He pointed toward my arm and my face. I sat in silence for a moment. I didn't know what to do or say. I took my sheet of paper and wrote the truth. It was an awkward moment of writing, but I did it. Father would make all his children dedicate themselves to him one piece at a time. For me, it was my arm, an eye, an ear, and my lips. For my brother, it was more, much, much more. He was close to being fully dedicated. Some tears smudged the ink as they fell onto the paper. It hadn't occurred to me beforehand how much like a monster I must have looked to these people. A boy with a missing arm, an empty eye socket, just a plain hole for an ear, not even any lips, just exposed gums and rotting teeth. I felt disgusting. Chief was pale. "And your brother?" he asked. "I suppose he must have crawled out of that place." I nodded, and tears continued to fall. After a long moment of silence, the chief looked at me and said, "You know, son, we're all born into some kind of cult or another. I'm glad you got out of yours."